Computer. Here we go. Should say, oh yeah, we're recording. Good. All right, everybody. My name's Bob Joseph, the junior, actually, in this conversation to the Robert Joseph Senior, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph Quinquinquilli Gitsi Wakias, and we've invited my dad, for those of you that don't know, we are related, to just answer questions for an upcoming Orange Shirt Day thing that we're going to run. So to get us started, I just have a couple of questions about residential schools and Orange Shirt Day. I know you've probably heard a lot about it, Dad, but for the viewers and the listeners, I just had a couple of questions for you. And my first question is, what is your memory of your first day at St. Michael's Residential School?
Thank you, Bob. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this little conversation. I'm really honored and pleased to be on your podcast. I spent 11 years in a residential school, and there is nothing clearer in my mind than that first day going to the school. It was frightening, it was terrifying, and it's something I've carried in the back of my mind for a long time, just how traumatic that was. I didn't know what trauma meant in those days, of course, but looking back, that's probably the worst day of my life. One of those early memories of going to a school. There was nothing more scary than coming from a little community where you had never left before, and the only people you knew were the indigenous peoples and their families, and the only language you knew was Kwakwala, the language of our particular group of indigenous people. And then suddenly to be turned over to a strange man at the entrance of the school in dark clothes with the collar on backwards, a white collar and white skin, and I didn't understand what language he was speaking. That was the first time I'd really heard English. So he said a lot of things, and my mother, my foster mother, turned me over. And I remember walking down this long hallway, smelling the smell of disinfectant, and hearing the pounding of our steps in this long hollow corridor. We went down 2 flights of steps down into the basement, and that's where some of the other little ones were, other little kids. And the first thing they got me to do was jump into a little chair that they set up as a barber chair, and they sheared my head. And when that was done, I got herded into a shower with a whole, probably a couple of dozen other little kids with similar haircuts and all naked. And what they did then was douse our head in kerosene and painted our bodies with the white liquid. And they poked and prodded us in embarrassing ways and embarrassing places. And I had never before in my entire 6 little years ever been so humiliated. And there was nothing kind about how they treated us or how they spoke to us. It was all denigrating. And for a little 6-year-old, that's really frightening. And the experience lasts forever. And I remember finally getting into my bed. The lights were turned out, the supervisor left, and I started to hear in the darkness all these little sniffles of other little boys crying. And they were going through the same thing that I was, a deep sense of loss, even abandonment, grief, and sadness. And they were all crying as softly as they could under the covers of their beds. And I remember doing that. I cried until I had no more tears. I couldn't really cry anymore because there were no more tears. And then when that happened, I started to I guess you can call it daydream of better things, better days before that moment. And I started to think about home, family, and the culture, and all the things that we used to do, the togetherness, belonging, and being connected to everything and everybody in our village. And of course, that deepened the sadness. And that went on for every year. And the first 2 or 3 years I went back to that school, would have that same experience, that same sadness, that same sense of abandonment, loneliness, that same sense of nobody caring or loving you enough, because we didn't understand when we were little what was going on. So it was actually horrific to be a little boy brought to a residential school for the first time and nobody really explaining what was going on.
Sounds pretty traumatic, eh? Pretty traumatic. And then the next question I wanted to ask you sort of moves you forward in your life a little bit. But as a father, how did you feel when your children started school?
There was no escaping the fact that when you kids, my kids, were starting to go to school, that every time one of you went to one of the schools in Camel River, that I was remembering the experience that I had in the name of education. And so my first thought always was, gee, I hope they have a good experience with this so-called education thing, because mine was so horrific, right? And I thought about safety for you, for your siblings when it was their turn. Because by then I began to recognize how deep the racism in this country was entrenched with many, many, many Canadians. And I really wanted to and prayed quietly and silently that your experience would be different, that it would be an experience that led to some kind of preparation for you as you grew into your adulthood that would allow you to be ready and to be confident and trained and have knowledge and have self-esteem and hope and aspirations, all of those things that were never, didn't exist for me. And I thought about those things every time that each of my children began to go to school. And so now we come to this moment. I think things have improved, but still there is a big divide between Indigenous people and all other Canadians. And we just have to keep working at developing understanding and creating better relationships between us so that all children are important, have value, have purpose, have worth, and are encouraged and inspired to be whatever they want to be.